What up, A-Push Nation? We are on Sectionalism. This is presentation 3, slide 68. I told you this was a big one. This is a brutal one. This is the big section of notes that we have over the break. Anyways, let's get started. Slide 68. We want to really try to get through some slides. Alrighty, let's go to the caning of Charles Sumner. Alrighty, so we know that the whole situation in Kansas is getting out of control. We've got pro-slavery border ruffians fighting with these northern abolitionists that have been sent there to settle. It's going back and forth, and people in Congress are discussing this, and they're kind of freaking out. And a northern abolitionist senator named Charles Sumner stands up and he gives a speech called Crimes Against Kansas, where he blames the Southerners and he blames slavery for all of the violence that's going on there. Some of the Southerners take offense at his speech. They kind of think like it's maybe insulting the senators from the South, including specifically the senators from South Carolina. But one of those South Carolina senators named Preston Brooks stands up and literally on the floor of Congress, he beats Charles Sumner with his gold-tipped cane. He cracks his head open. I believe he breaks his skull in something like five places. Caused slight brain damage at the time, although he is going to recover later on. Folks, this is crazy. Alrighty, I mean, it's one thing for people to be fighting in the Wild West out there in Kansas, alrighty, on the western frontier. It's a whole other thing for in the floor of Congress. I mean, in Congress, senators refer to one another by literally like the gentleman and the gentle lady. It's all about rapport and respect and tradition. And here we literally have Congress, the Senate, devolving into this fist fight, literally, where people are nearly beating each other to death over this issue. Clearly, the issue of slavery has gotten almost to be an out-of-control issue here. And by the way, when the caning was going on, other Southern senators prevented the Northerners from helping him. They physically blocked him and kind of were laughing, some of them were, as this guy was being bludgeoned. Anyways, craziness. Now, back to Kansas again, 1856, slide 70, I should say. What happens here is, it's called the Potawatomi Massacre. A northern kind of radical, a religious extremist, his name is John Brown. He and his sons decide they're going to go into Kansas and they're going to make a statement. And they actually move into Missouri, where the slavery guys are coming from. And they surprise a group of pro-slavery guys. And they slaughter them with broadswords, and then they get away. And so he believes he's doing the work of God. He believes God commands him to do this. He escapes again. He's going to be kind of around later on again. As a result of this, along with all of these craziness that's going on, again, Kansas erupts into a mini civil war. It's going to be called Bleeding Kansas. And the violence, it's almost like the violence just continues to escalate. Alrighty. Oh, by the way, while all of this is going on in 1857, Kansas actually applied to be a state. They had the people for it, and the Southerners, remember, had won the election, so they wanted to try to apply for statehood and make Kansas officially slave. What happened was there was another election. The Northerners, the free people, the people who supported Kansas being a free state that lived in Kansas, boycotted the election. They thought it was corrupt. They thought it was fixed, because it was. What that meant was the Southerners won the election again, and they sent their constitution, which was a slave constitution, to Congress. The president supported it. Douglas led the opposition to it. Eventually it was sent back because it didn't have enough votes to get support in Congress, and they basically tried to rewrite it, tried to send it again, but before they could, Civil War breaks out. Kansas never officially became a slave state. During the Civil War, it technically is going to stay loyal to the North, to the Union, and it was accepted as a free state then. The Kansas issue completely divides the Democratic Party, and here's why. James Buchanan, the president at the time, supported the Kansas split. He supported it. Douglas opposed, Douglas's opposition to Kansas alienated him from Southerners. What I mean is, Douglas is responsible for the Kansas being created, for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but then you got to understand, he led the opposition to the Lecompton Constitution, to making Kansas a slave state. So Southerners turn on him. James Buchanan, the president, supports Kansas being a slave state. Douglas, the leader of Congress, who's the other major Democrat, is against it. And so this is going to divide the party. It's going to prevent Douglas from winning the presidency because Southerners are never going to vote for him. Alrighty. Anyways, it's now the Whigs and the Democrats that have been divided by the issue of slavery. There's a number of important publications you need to be aware of as we move to number 74. Obviously, the most important work ever in the history of the anti-slave movement is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's the story of a plantation. It's the story of a really abusive plantation owner and the slaves that live under his control, in particular a slave named Uncle Tom. Anyways, it really portrayed the horrors, the abuses of the slave system. It's ironic because Stowe had not really gone throughout the South very much. He had a small kind of encounter with it, which was one of the criticisms of the book. It was inspired by the Fugitive Slave Law. After the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, she was trying to change people's hearts and minds, make them opposed to slavery. She was very much an evangelical. She was influenced by the Second Great Awakening, like most of these abolitionists were. It was the bestseller of its time. It's considered one of the biggest bestsellers of all time. It's considered maybe the most impactful book up to its time written by any American. And the abolitionist movement grew tremendously because of it. Southerners, of course, condemned it. There were a number of Southern apologists who wrote responses to it, criticizing every aspect of it. Alrighty, slide 77, Hinton Helper. This guy was funny. He wrote a nonfiction book. He actually tried to appeal to the reason, to the minds of Southerners, of white Southerners, non-slaveholders, and basically tried to tell them, hey, slavery is bad for you. It keeps you in a permanently poor position. Of course, it was not really widely read. It was widely criticized by Southerners. They wrote dozens of responses where they argued slavery was good. It's considered an example of literature that led people in the North to support abolition, although again it was criticized mightily in the South. Alrighty. Anyways, let's move on to number 80. The election of 1856, because this is when Buchanan is nominated. He takes over for Pierce. Pierce was kind of seen as ineffective. Douglas dominated politics, didn't really care for Pierce, and so ultimately James Buchanan was nominated, the Southerner. He ran on one issue, really, popular sovereignty. I'm going to maintain popular sovereignty. And in this craziness in 1856 where Southerners threatened, Republicans, by the way, nominated their first candidate. His name is John Fremont. He was a Mexican War hero. He was a guy who technically led the rescue or the capture of California. Again, he promised no extension of slavery into the territories, so you either can vote Democrat and keep popular sovereignty, you go Republican and you prevent the extension of slavery. Here's the thing, we also had the Know-Nothings. They ran a candidate. It actually was the old President Millard Fillmore. They opposed all immigration of any type, Irish, German, Mexican, Chinese. They were anti-Catholic. They actually had some of the members supported the old Whig Party. So they run in this election as well. They're going to take some votes away from the Republican. Here's the other problem. Is that Southerners had promised, if you vote Republican, if the nation votes Republican, we'll secede, we'll break away. That was enough at this time to scare enough Americans into voting Democrat to keep the stability, because the thought of civil war was so frightening, was so scary, that they'd be responsible for ripping the nation apart. Ultimately, in 1860, the Southerners are going to do the same thing. They're going to threaten the rest of the country. If you vote for this Republican, we'll immediately secede. That time, the nation doesn't balk. They don't hesitate. They vote for the Republican anyways. Alrighty. Ultimately, folks, let us go to slide 84. It'll show you the electoral map. Again, it's a pretty big route for Buchanan because, well, he promised not to upset the balance. Alrighty, he promised to keep the same. Now, by the way, let's take a look at number 86 at where Buchanan's ranked. Let's look at where Pierce is ranked too. 40th, Buchanan 42nd. Alrighty, I told you these folks are not remembered well. Millard Fillmore 37th, right, came before him. Zachary Taylor 29th, which is funny because he did virtually nothing in 2 years. But anyways, not strong leaders. That's part of the problem. It's one of the reasons I think that we have this war, is because there were not strong presidents in charge at the time. Let's go to slide 88. We're going to have these major crises in the 1850s, in the mid to late 1850s, that are going to lead to the rise of Abraham Lincoln as the new president. Let's start with the Dred Scott case. In 1857, a major Supreme Court case is going to happen. It's going to involve slavery. Finally, the Supreme Court's going to chime in. Now, here's what you need to know. The court's dominated by Southerners, led by a Southern Chief Justice, Roger Taney. The story had to do with Dred Scott. Scott was a slave. He had lived with his master for 5 years in free states in the North. And he had sued. His master basically died. He was sold to another master. He was going to go back down south again. He was persuaded by abolitionists to sue for his freedom, arguing, hey, I've been in free territory for 5 years. I ought to be free. Ultimately, again, the court dominated by Southerners, and they were strong defenders of slavery at this particular time. Some of them actually were old holdovers from the Jackson era, including the Chief Justice. The decision was that Dred Scott was a black slave and not a citizen, and couldn't even sue in federal court. As a result, what he was implying there is all blacks, north and south, were no longer citizens. Slaves could no longer be taken away from their owners without the due process of law. For the slave owner, what that meant was anytime a slave was taken away, the owner could sue. They could use all legal measures. They could use the courts to try to get their slave back. They ruled the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. It was obsolete anyways, but they would have ruled it unconstitutional because they said the court can never forbid slavery in federal territories, even if the territories wished it. If a person is a slave and a slaveholder brings them into that territory, they're always a slave. They'll always be one. Alrighty. How controversial is that, right? What a controversial decision. They basically said, hey, slave owners, unless you can always go up and get your slaves, unless they have their free papers, alrighty, unless they have their guaranteed freedom, they can be taken back at any time. It didn't matter if they had lived their entire life in the North, except for the day they were born, alrighty. Even if they lived in the North their entire time, they were still slaves according to that policy, according to that decision. What a controversy. 93, the impact. Again, it contributed to the split of the Democratic Party. Northerners were horrified by this. They blamed anybody that had supported or proposed popular sovereignty, including Douglas. Southerners were thrilled. This was a huge victory for them. They saw the hope, the possibility of maybe creating many new slave states that previously would have been impossible. Republicans, of course, tried to claim that the decision was wrong and that it didn't matter, that it could be overturned, that it could be ignored. Alrighty. Of course, that was them just trying to I think, make themselves feel better after this kind of shock to the North and to the Republican Party. Anyways, controversy. Considered one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court. It's going to be destroyed by future courts when they go back and review that decision. Alrighty. About this time, actually, slide 94 tells us that we actually had a panic. Alrighty, it was about time and we had a panic. Again, over speculation of land. That's the third straight panic caused by over speculation of land. So banks giving out the loans, same problems. Can't pay them back. Those caused bank crises. We had a couple of other problems as well this time. Over speculation of railroads. Alrighty, internal improvements. We had a huge amount of gold that came into the economy from California. That caused inflation to go way up. We kind of pumped too much gold into the economy too fast. Also, we produced too much grain. We were feeding the Europeans during the Crimean War. Suddenly, they didn't need our food anymore. After the war ended, we were left with all this extra grain that we couldn't sell. It brought grain production to a halt. Alrighty, so anyways, these three things added up. It just so happened that the North was the hardest hit. They had very widespread, large unemployment numbers. Southerners really weren't. The cotton industry wasn't really affected. The cash crop agriculture wasn't nearly harmed as much because there was so much demand overseas. Ultimately, what it did was some big things. One, it convinced Southerners maybe that they were stronger, they're economically stronger than they really were. Many of them began to say, hey, we don't need the North. We can maybe break away from them. We could fight them, and we might be able to win. Maybe their industry isn't important as people have always told us. Secondly, Westerners demanded free farmland. They basically said, hey, give us free farmland in these areas where nobody wants to go. We'll settle there. We'll try to set up farms there. And we'll try to make food to help out the economy. This is going to lead to something called the Homestead Act, where the government's actually going to agree to this. They're going to let people settle in harsh lands for free in an effort to try to make them successful. There were calls for higher tariffs to protect the industry since the North had been hurt so badly. And in fact, when the Republicans run in 1860 under Lincoln, he runs for a couple of extra things besides the stopping the spread of slavery. Higher tariffs, and he wants to propose those homestead for those Western farmers who were so hard hit by this panic. But of course, before Lincoln can become president, he's going to need to become a household name, a national name. Well, that happens here with something called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. First, he runs for Senate in Illinois. He runs against Stephen Douglas. Douglas is like the most famous man in the country, or one of the most famous politicians. Lincoln's a nobody. He challenges Douglas to a series of debates. Douglas accepts them. By the way, Lincoln is massive. He's this giant, tall, long kind of dude. Douglas is short and midget. They called him the Little Giant. So they were kind of comedy when they debated against each other. Folks, what happens is they have a series of these debates and a series of back and forth with each other. Lincoln kind of uses these debates to really kind of almost embarrass Douglas. A lot of the time, folks kind of felt like this guy Lincoln, nobody had ever heard of, kind of got the better of Douglas. He becomes kind of a hero of Republicans nationwide. Ultimately, guys, he's going to lose the senatorial election. Douglas stays senator. He wins in Illinois. But Lincoln becomes so popular because of these debates and kind of the way he embarrassed Douglas in some of them. That ultimately it's Lincoln who is going to become the president in 1860 when he's able to when he's nominated by the Republicans. The biggest strength Lincoln had in these debates was he got Douglas to basically acknowledge that if he were president, he would disregard the Dred Scott decision and he'd still open up the states to popular sovereignty. When Southerners hear that, they decide once and for all, we'll never vote for Douglas. That destroys his chances of unifying the party and winning in 1860. Makes it easier for the Republicans to win. Alrighty, anyways, once again, Douglas wins the senatorial spot after the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but Lincoln's going to be the big winner in the presidential election in 1860. Right before that, we've got another major violent incident that breaks out. It's going to involve John Brown. Yep, we remember him, the guy from Potawatomi who was responsible for hacking those guys to death. Well, he's back here in 1859. Now his plans are much grander, much larger. He decides he's going to lead a slave rebellion throughout the South, but first he needs weapons. And so he's going to rob an armory. He's going to seize an armory in the South. It's in Virginia at a place called Harper's Ferry. He and his supporters, he believes that they're endowed by God with these powers, alrighty, and they're especially going to be supported, and all the slaves are going to join with them. What they do is they go to this place called Harper's Ferry. They seize this armory, and basically almost then everything goes badly. They're surrounded by troops. Ultimately, people die, including a few blacks, ironically enough, including a free black who just happened to be passing by at the wrong time. Ultimately, Brown and his supporters are captured. They're hanged. Brown becomes a martyr in the North. He becomes a martyr, a hero of abolitionists. He gave his life, just like Elijah Lovejoy, for this cause. Emerson and others kind of almost made him seem like a Christ-like figure. The Southerners just despised him. They thought he was the worst of the worst. They thought he was everything that was wrong with the North. Ultimately, most Americans actually kind of felt like Brown got what he deserved. Even though he supported ending slavery, he went too far. He killed people, brutally murdered them, and they argued two wrongs did not make a right. One way or the other, this is considered a huge, huge immediate cause of the war. Southerners immediately began building armies, militias, expecting there would be more of these rebellion-like attacks in the future. Alrighty, folks. We are going to stop it there so that we begin with slide number 108 the next time around, and that'll take us through the end of the sectionalism notes. So we've got one more video to go, and that should be a shorter one. Until then, Mr. Majewski.